All right, let's dive into a topic that's shaped North America in huge ways.
Yeah.
The fur trade. We've got a whole mix of sources for this one. Quizzes, essays, briefing documents, FAQs, even a textbook chapter. They all highlight this incredible story. Cultural clashes, economic empires, a legacy that we're still dealing with today, and we're going to unpack all of it.
It's so easy to get caught up in the dates and battles of history.
Right.
But the fur trade, it's a perfect example of how economics and cultural exchange, they can be just as powerful, maybe even more so, because of those long-lasting effects.
Oh, absolutely. Those ripple effects are what make history so fascinating to me. And speaking of stories, one of our sources kicks off with a First Nations oral account of their first encounter with Captain Cook's ship.
Oh, wow.
Okay, get this. They thought the Europeans were fish transformed into people.
Wow, that's wild. It really shows you the shock of that first contact, right?
Yep.
And how completely different their worldviews were.
It's incredible. Like, can you imagine? It must have taken a long time to even establish the kind of understanding and respect needed for trade to even begin.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you're talking about people from totally different worlds trying to find common ground.
It's amazing that they managed to do it at all.
Yeah.
But, it wasn't all friendly first encounters and cultural exchanges. We've also got a source from a Spaniard who describes First Nations people in this super clinical way.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He focuses only on physical traits, ignores their culture completely, like he's observing specimens under a microscope, no respect for their way of life or anything.
Yeah. That brings up this concept called ethnocentrism. The belief that your own culture is superior to others.
Right, right. The classic, my way's the right way kind of thinking.
Exactly. And that Spaniard's viewpoint is like a textbook example of that.
Okay, so we've got these two totally different perspectives on those first encounters. But eventually, trade did start happening, right? And we have to remember, this was all based on the barter system. No cash involved.
No cash, just straight up trading goods.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what kinds of things were being exchanged?
Well, First Nations groups were getting things like metal tools, blankets, guns.
Tactical stuff.
Yeah, things that could make life easier or improve their existing technology. But for the Europeans, it was all about those luxury furs, especially beaver.
For those fancy hats.
Oh, yeah. Beaver felt hats were all the rage back in Europe, huge status symbol. So you can already see the seeds of this unequal power dynamic playing out.
Right, so on the surface, it's just people trading stuff they have for stuff they want. But the economic implications were way bigger than that.
Absolutely. It sounds like the European traders were the ones who really profited from this system, especially those backed by those big companies like the Hudson's Bay Company.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
They had the resources and infrastructure to really capitalize on the fur trade. But let's not forget about the role that First Nations knowledge and skills played in all of this.
Oh, absolutely critical. I mean, the Europeans wouldn't have survived, let alone profited, without them. Think about it. They knew the land.
Yeah, the animals.
The best hunting techniques. And let's not forget the First Nations women.
Oh, they were vital to the whole operation. You don't always hear about that side of the story. What was their role?
I mean, they were essential, not just passively involved. They were preparing the furs, working in the trading posts, acting as interpreters and guides. There's this source that mentions Matanabe, a Dean explorer.
Okay.
And he absolutely refused to travel without women because their skills were that critical for survival in the wilderness.
Yeah, that says a lot. So we've got this whole treaty network running, but it wasn't all cooperation and smooth sailing, right?
Yeah.
The French and English had totally different approaches to the fur trade.
Yeah, it was like a clash of styles. The French, at least initially, they were much more about integrating into those First Nations communities. They learned languages, adopted some customs. They even sent those coureurs de bois, those adventurous traders, deep inland to build relationships and trade directly.
Smart strategy.
Yeah, it gave them access to furs and expanded their territory. Meanwhile, the English, mainly through the Hudson's Bay Company, they were all about efficiency and profit, setting up these fortified trading posts and basically waiting for First Nations groups to bring the furs to them.
Way less romantic.
Yeah.
Just pure business.
Maybe so, but that efficient approach actually gave them a long-term advantage. They could get goods to and from Europe in a year, while it took the French twice as long. That kind of efficiency. It really foreshadows how they eventually came to dominate the trade.
Wow, so even in those early days, you could see the seeds of how things would eventually play out. But hold on, before we jump ahead too far, there's this huge turning point we have to talk about. The Great Peace of Montreal in 1701.
Oh, yeah.
Decades of fighting between the French, their First Nations allies, and the Haudenosaunee finally came to an end.
Big moment.
Huge. 1,300 delegates from 40 First Nations gathered in Montreal. Can you imagine? That must have been an incredible sight.
It really shows you how much everyone wanted peace and stability. And the Council of Three Fires.
Remind me who that is.
That's the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwa. They really pushed for this peace treaty. It wasn't just about peace, though.
No.
They understood the economic benefits of a peaceful, thriving fur trade.
That makes sense. Less fighting, more trading.
Exactly. And with that peace came an explosion of economic activity. Those coureurs de bois could now travel further inland safely, expanding the French fur trade's reach even more. Which, speaking of travel, brings us to the real star of the show. The birch bark canoe. I mean, no cars, no trains, no planes back then.
Right.
These canoes, absolute masterpieces, lightweight, easy to maneuver, tough enough to handle those long, long journeys.
Yeah, those canoes were incredible feats of engineering. We even have a quote from Champlain, the guy who founded Quebec, praising their versatility. He said they could navigate even the smallest rivers. Pretty impressive.
Yeah, and that access to waterways was key. It gave the French a big advantage thanks to the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. While the English, they were initially stuck dealing with the Adirondack Mountains. Not ideal for canoe travel.
So we've got the canoes, the trade routes. But who were the big names pushing westward?
Well, our sources mention a few, and it seems like collaboration was key to their success.
Yeah, you can't conquer a continent on your own.
Exactly. Take Pierre La Vérendrye, for example. This explorer who opened up the Saskatchewan River route. But he didn't do it alone. He relied heavily on First Nations guides and their knowledge of the land.
It's like that saying, teamwork makes the dream work. Or in this case, teamwork makes the westward expansion work.
Right. And then there's Alexander Mackenzie, the guy who worked with the Nor'westers. He was the first European to cross the continent.
Wow.
And he had a Métis guide named François Beaulieu helping him navigate. Pretty incredible. Although his first attempt to find a route to the Pacific, well, let's just say it landed him in the Arctic Ocean instead. He even called it the River of Disappointment.
Oops.
Yeah, it just goes to show that even the most ambitious explorers...
They needed help.
They needed the help of people who knew the land. And speaking of the Métis, their emergence is a direct result of the fur trade. This blend of French and First Nation cultures created a unique identity, and they played key roles as interpreters, guides, and buffalo hunters.
So they were a vital part of the fur trade ecosystem.
Yeah.
We've got this blending of cultures, economic expansion, new territories being explored. But as things got more competitive, the fur trade took a bit of a dark turn, especially in 1860s Alberta.
Oh, yeah. That's when you see this influx of American free traders coming in, looking to exploit the lack of law enforcement. And this led to some pretty awful practices, especially the whiskey trade.
Where they traded cheap alcohol for furs, right?
Exactly. And it often wasn't even good alcohol. Sometimes it was poisonous, basically. Devastating impact on First Nation communities.
Yeah, the sources paint a pretty bleak picture of Fort Whoop-Up, one of the most notorious whiskey trading posts.
Oh, yeah.
This place was a fortress, a stockade, cannons, iron bars, the whole 9 yards. It really symbolizes the exploitation and violence that was rampant at the time.
And the consequences were severe. I mean, this alcohol wasn't just bad booze, it was often toxic, leading to illness, violence, and the breakdown of traditional ways of life. One source talks about the Kainai First Nation suffering 70 deaths in a single winter because of this whiskey trade.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of greed.
Absolutely.
So it's clear that the fur trade had a profound impact, both good and bad. And we're still grappling with its legacy today. On the one hand, you've got this incredible cultural exchange. Europeans and First Nations adopted each other's technologies and ways of life.
Right. It wasn't just a one-way street. Both sides were learning and adapting. It shows a real willingness to recognize the value in different approaches. But at the same time, we can't ignore the devastation inflicted on First Nations communities.
Right. It's a complicated story.
It is. The fur trade made them dependent on European goods, which disrupted their traditional economies. Overhunting wiped out resources like beaver and buffalo, and being displaced from their lands led to conflict. And then there's the impact of European diseases, especially smallpox, which was just devastating for entire communities.
Absolutely heartbreaking. And it's something that still has ripple effects today. But there are efforts being made to address those injustices.
Yeah, for sure. One source mentions the repatriation of Haida remains from the Chicago Field Museum in 2003. That seems like a powerful step towards acknowledging and correcting the wrongs of the past.
Definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, but it's clear that the legacy of the fur trade is still very much alive. It's woven into the very fabric of Canada.
Absolutely. And understanding its complexities is crucial for building a more just and equitable future. It really gets you thinking, doesn't it? How progress isn't always a straight line, and how understanding history can help us learn from those past mistakes. But let's shift gears for a minute and talk about the economic side of things. Remember those beaver felt hats we talked about earlier?
Oh yeah, super fashionable back in the day.
They weren't just a fashion statement, though. They were fueling a global industry.
That's right. Those hats were like the status symbol in Europe.
Mhm.
And you know what? It makes sense that as the beaver populations in those easier to reach areas started to dwindle, those fur traders had to venture further and further inland to keep up with the demand.
Exactly. The pursuit of fashion essentially led to the mapping of rivers, the creation of new trading posts, and this huge expansion of European knowledge about the West.
Wow. Who knew a hat could have such an impact? It's like a fashion-driven exploration.
It's a great example of how economics can drive exploration and territorial expansion. But we also have to remember, this expansion wasn't just about European ambition, it was also shaped by the relationships and alliances they built with First Nations people.
Absolutely. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier with La Vérendrye and Mackenzie relying on those First Nations guides. Their success really highlights how important those partnerships were. So, as we start to wrap up this deep dive into the fur trade, I keep coming back to this idea of legacy. What does all of this mean for us today? How do we make sense of it all?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The fur trade. It was this absolutely pivotal period in North American history. It laid the groundwork for the economic and social systems we see today, but it also left behind this mixed bag of cultural exchange, economic inequality, and this lasting impact on Indigenous communities.
And it's a legacy that's still playing out today. Right? We see it in things like land claims, the struggle to revitalize indigenous languages and cultures, and the ongoing efforts towards reconciliation. It's a reminder that history isn't just something in a textbook. It's something we're still living with, still trying to understand.
I think that's what makes these deep dives so valuable. It's not just about memorizing facts and dates. It's about grappling with the nuances, the complexities. It's about the human stories that have shaped our world and asking those tough questions about how the past continues to inform the present.
You mentioning cultural exchange reminded me of something else from our sources. Both the Europeans and the First Nations people, they were actually adopting each other's technologies and ways of life.
Oh, yeah.
It's like they were recognizing the good ideas and saying, hey, I'm going to try that. Like the Europeans embracing the canoe
Right.
and First Nations people starting to use those metal tools. It's kind of cool to see that kind of exchange and adaptation happening.
It really highlights the adaptability and ingenuity of both groups. They saw the value in different approaches and weren't afraid to incorporate new ideas into their own practices.
So we've talked a lot about the barter system and its lasting economic impacts. But there's one more economic angle I'm curious about. Those American free traders we discussed earlier, the ones behind that whole whiskey trade. They were operating outside the established system, right? Were they kind of like the original bootleggers?
You could say that. They saw an opportunity to profit by exploiting a lack of regulation. And unfortunately, they were willing to do whatever it took to make a quick buck. They didn't care about the long-term consequences for those First Nation communities.
Their whole operation sounds incredibly ruthless. It really makes you wonder how much of that mentality still exists today, just in different forms.
It's a valid question. That desire for quick profits, regardless of the ethical or social costs, it's something we still see in various industries, unfortunately. It's a reminder that economic systems, no matter how well-intentioned they might be, can be vulnerable to exploitation.
Yeah, and it emphasizes the need for strong regulations and ethical considerations in business. I guess the lesson here is that we need to be constantly vigilant about that potential for exploitation, even in those seemingly legitimate economic activities.
Exactly. And we need to hold those in power accountable for creating systems that prioritize fairness and sustainability over those short-term gains. The well-being of people and the planet should always come first.
Well said. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from those initial encounters and those clashing worldviews to the intricacies of that barter system and the very different approaches of the French and the English.
We've explored the absolutely crucial role of First Nations women, the emergence of the Métis people, the significance of events like the Great Peace of Montreal, and the sheer ingenuity of that birch bark canoe.
We even dug into some of the darker sides of the fur trade, like that whiskey trade and the exploitation that happened at Fort Whoop-Up. It's been a fascinating journey through history, but as we've seen, it's a journey that's far from over.
And throughout it all, we've been examining those lasting impacts, both positive and negative, on cultural exchange, economic development, and even the identity of Canada as a nation.
We've touched on the idea that the fur trade's legacy isn't just something confined to the past. It continues to shape the present. It influences everything from those land claims to the ongoing efforts towards reconciliation. It's a reminder that history is an ongoing conversation, and that understanding the past is absolutely essential if we want to build a more just and equitable future for everyone. It's amazing, isn't it? It really is like peeling back the layers of an onion. The more we learn about the fur trade, the more we realize there's so much more to uncover.
It's a journey of discovery for sure. And, it makes you appreciate how everything is connected. I mean, this seemingly simple exchange of goods set off this chain reaction that transformed a whole continent.
And speaking of journeys, it feels like we've reached the end of ours for today. From those first encounters and the clashing worldviews to the complexities of the barter system and the different approaches of the French and English, we've covered so much ground.
We talked about those incredible First Nations women, the rise of the Métis people, those pivotal moments like the Great Peace of Montreal, and the ingenuity of the birch bark canoe. We even explored the darker side of the trade, like the devastating impact of the whiskey trade and the exploitation at Fort Whoop-Up. It's been quite a ride.
It really has. But, like any good journey, it leaves us with more than just memories. It leaves us with questions. Questions about how we understand history, how we acknowledge the past, and how we can build a future that honors the sacrifices and contributions of everyone who came before us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a conversation that needs to keep going. If we want to create a more just and equitable future, we have to understand the past.
Absolutely. So to all our listeners out there, think about everything we've discussed today and consider this. If something as seemingly insignificant as beaver pelts could have such far-reaching consequences, what seemingly insignificant commodity today might have a similar impact on the future? What unintended consequences do we need to be aware of as we navigate the complexities of the modern world?
That's a great question to ponder. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the patterns and the forces that continue to shape our world today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope we've sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep exploring the complexities of history.